All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for showing up to this book talk with Dr. Paolo Gerbaudo, with the discussion led by Dr. Anton Jäger. My name is Maximilian Wolf. I'm a member of the European Center for Populism Studies, and I will be moderating this conversation. Our author today is Dr. Paolo Gerbaudo. He is Marie Curie Fellow at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy, and reader in digital politics at King's College London, where he's also the director of the Center for Digital Culture. His works, besides a number of influential papers, include books such as Tweets in the Streets, Social Media and Contemporary Activism, The Digital Party, and in 2021, the book that we will be focusing on today, The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and the Pandemic. His work focuses on the intersection between the digital world, social media, and activism, social movements, and populism on the other hand. His discussant for today will be Dr. Anton Jäger. He is postdoctoral fellow at KU Leuven at the Institute of Philosophy. And he has written for a number of influential publications, including Jacobin, New Left Review, and The Guardian. And he completed his PhD in the history of the American populist movement in the 19th century, and has focused a lot on the intellectual history and debates within populism studies more broadly. The book we'll be discussing today, as I've said, is The Great Recoil, in which Dr. Gerbaudo foresees COVID as a watershed moment for in the ideological terrain of the Western political landscape. Away from the exopolitics of globalization towards an endopolitics of return to the nation state, return to national powers, and so on. The discourse of the endopolitics and the discourse of the Great Recoil is structured in his argument by three master signifiers: sovereignty, protection, and control. And he argues that it has so far been only the radical right and the radical populist right who have to this day understood the salience of these signifiers and the salience and the importance that they hold in structuring the political terrain of tomorrow. His book concludes with a progressive rearticulation of those signifiers and the vision of how the politics of the progressive left needs to change in order to contend with this endopolitical shift. So without further ado, I will hand the floor to our discussant, Anton Jäger, and he can get us started.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. I recently participated in a roundtable on Paolo's book, in which I tried to set out some of my thoughts and some questions. So I'll mainly be reiterating some points from that previous roundtable and adding some more comments. I'm trying to keep it under 10 to 15 minutes, if that's not too long. And then Paolo will have ample time to respond. And then we can just do a more general discussion from there if people have questions. So I first want to start just with a note of congratulation, because I think that The Great Recoil is for defining in a very definite analysis of this new COVID world we're currently entering. I don't think we're leaving it yet. If we look at the latest waves, which are mainly hitting Asia, I don't think we're out of pandemic territory in any sense. And what's mainly impressive about the book is that it was published so shortly after that great confinement started. So we have some literature already, for example, by Adam Tooze, such as Shutdown, which came out in 2021. Then there are works such as Toby Green's COVID Consensus, which also came out in 2021. But what these works really share together with Paolo's book is an attempt to move beyond think pieces and hot takes and actually give us a measured and intelligent assessment of what exact world has been produced by that March 2020, or rather the 2020 COVID shock. I also want to say that this type of instant analysis, or the attempt to write analysis of a situation which is still ongoing, is of course very well known. I make the comparison with a kind of high-speed camera, where the enterprise of contemporary history always risks that you fall prey to the liquidity and the indeterminacy of the situation it wants to capture. Now, at the beginning of the book, Paolo actually mentions a different book by probably one of the most famous political scientists of the 20th century, who is Franz Neumann. So one of the political scientists within the Frankfurt School, who he takes inspiration for, mainly Neumann's Behemoth. What's interesting about Behemoth is that it was written during the war. So it's an analysis of the Nazi state, which produced as the war with the Nazi state was still ongoing. And I think that shows that there is indeed a capacity to write that type of contemporary political analysis and contemporary history, which doesn't simply fall prey to trendiness or to the instantaneity of what's happening. And I think the virtues of Paolo's book are exactly also the virtues of Neumann's book, is that it gives us a bestiary of this new COVID Leviathan, as you call it, which tracks the decomposition and the recomposition of state authority in a time of crisis, and what exact factions are determining the shape of this new monster of the state. Given Paolo's background, I think we can also see that he fuses two areas of specialism here. And so he's written a lot on the populist decade and the specific kind of organizational features of the movements we've seen arise in the last 10 years. So that was the subject of previous books such as The Digital Party, but also The Mask and the Flag, which I think are some of the most serious and sustained attempts to actually capture the specificity of social movements in the 21st century. But he does share a difference, or rather he shows a difference with some of the more mainstream approaches in populism studies, is that he's not just a discourse analyst, he's not just a sort of positive, or rather positivist political scientist, but he's actually also a proper political sociologist. So he also asks the questions, parties and many populist parties make these rhetorical claims, they invoke certain constituencies, but then he also looks very carefully about what are the actual social constituencies these parties rely on, and what kind of material shifts, what material bases are there for their types of politics. So this is particularly refreshing about the book, is that unlike some tendencies in populism studies, such as, for example, the Leclercian discourse one, Paolo actually does practice sociology as well, which makes some of his analysis far more concrete and less abstract than the ones we know from usual work in the discipline. So that's the first big virtue. And then the second virtue, I think, is that there's also some really nice excursions on the history of political thought. So this is something which is obviously quite dear to my heart, but we get references to Hobbes, to Machiavelli, to Plato, and to Cicero, and of course to Neumann itself. And this really shows just how crucial this particular combination has proven. Now, as we come to the main argument of the book as such, I think we can sum it up in the idea that Paolo does think that there was a death knell or sort of terminal crisis for a specific ideal of neoliberal governance, which was inaugurated by the 2020 lockdowns. So he's not the only one to make that diagnosis. I think if you read work by Jäger or even stuff by Grace Blakely, they've also diagnosed the so-called new state, which is no longer stingy with funds, which is fiscally quite ambitious. But I do think he provides the most convincing argument of how exactly COVID has completely shifted this policy regime or shifted the policy consensus on that. I think, no, there's still a lot of discussion, mainly in the United States, whether it actually makes sense to talk about the death of neoliberalism in that sense. I see that, for example, Paolo has conducted several debates online where he mentions certain recent proposals to say, see, there actually is a case in which neoliberalism is dying at this point. But I think adding up all the evidence, he's certainly in the majority, and I think the evidence clearly points in the direction. Even if neoliberalism is not dead, the neoliberal policy consensus has lost most of its coherence. Already after 2008, we can see it was turning into this weird Frankenstein-like hybrid beast. I don't think we can recognize anything of the offensive neoliberalism or the sort of confident neoliberalism we knew from the 1980s and 1990s. I recently wrote a review of a novel by Michel Houellebecq, which I think signifies this sort of cultural shift in a very good way. That even though you could say that neoliberal policies will still retain their attraction as a sort of basic capitalist reflex, now, of course, they will always remain the favorite of several business lobbies, et cetera, et cetera. But for example, they're very hard to win elections with anymore. Just look at the recent French presidential contest. Even someone like Macron was running on promises of reindustrialization. Someone like Le Pen is openly playing on a social nativism. Someone like Zemmour was even more fastidious and even more convinced of that. It doesn't seem as if there are any neoliberals around who feel confident winning on neoliberal platforms. So even if the beast is not dead yet, it's now been transmogrified, or it's changed to such an intensive degree that I don't think it makes sense to still talk about a neoliberal policy regime. Now, that is a convincing analysis, but it also throws up a variety of questions. The first thing is that with the passing of this neoliberal policy consensus, which I think Paolo is right to diagnose, we are actually being confronted with more enduring features of a capitalist society, which neoliberalism has covered over. So, of course, the end of neoliberalism does not mean the rebirth of social democracy, which is a point that Adam Tooze has recently also made. There are more dangerous varieties of capitalist management which are out there, which are also showing their head. And this actually confronts us with the question, what are those more enduring features of capitalist economies and capitalist societies, which we are now being faced to reckon with? And how does Paolo actually see our analytical task in the face of that? So, of course, neoliberalism as an object is now less reliable, it's lost its coherence. But what discussion should we actually be having about the capitalism that is appearing underneath, and whether maybe there are varieties of capitalist management that are not neoliberal, but are in no way emancipatory, of course. I think we can clearly say that someone like Joe Biden has not succeeded so far in becoming a second FDR. He's clearly not a box standard neoliberal either, but how can we best define this particular policy regime he's presiding over? That to me is the first question. Secondly, I think we should ask the question about not just discontinuity, but also continuity with the previous regime. And if we look at how COVID management, for example, has taken place, what kind of proposals have been put forward, there we actually see a recalibration and activation of this sort of private public state, which was so typical of the high neoliberal era at the time. And Adam Tooze has recently also used the word a disinhibited public-private project, where, for example, the state now feels confident that it can spend enormous amounts of money, can literally add a couple of zeros to its accounts as if they were MMT enthusiasts, but in which the public sector as such has not really retained the planning capacity or the sort of state capacity, which was very typical for the mid-20th century. Something like the vaccine effort is a very typical example of this. Enormous amounts of money which have been rechanneled from the state into the private sector, which made for a very, very quick development, which in and of itself, of course, didn't mean that the state was able to develop these vaccines themselves. And I would like to ask Paolo how you would, what is the right name for this type of hybrid? Because it's not the stingy, austere, public-private, predatory regime we know from before, or even after 2008, but it clearly is also not the mid-century planning states, or let alone socialism, which we knew from the 20th century. So what does he consider a proper term for that new configuration? And so all in all, I think someone like Nicholas Mulder has used the notion of a globalization without globalists, which we're currently seeing. So underneath the neoliberal momentum, the basics of capitalist statecraft have not shifted fundamentally. There has been a great recoil, but capitalist society is hardly in the process of being sublated. Now, of course, Paolo also makes the point that any prediction about the future of our post-COVID world always implies a certain abdication of agency. So Franz Neumann wrote his book Behemoth because he wanted the United States to defeat Nazi Germany. So this was not just a descriptive statement, but it was also a prescriptive statement. And I think we can see something similar in Paolo's book, that the Great Recoil is not just a description, but also a call to arms, and is an attempt to incite certain people on the left to actually take up the task and lead the political situation at the time. And even if we're entering a weird era of a recalibrated public-private state, a sort of populism which survives, which doesn't resemble the populism we knew from the 2010s. The question is, what opportunities does it present to the left specifically, and how should we best characterize this immensely difficult and immensely confusing situation? It's become almost painfully cliche to talk about Gramsci's phrase about this is the time of monsters here, but I think I will have to reiterate it again. We're in a very, very long interregnum. Interregnum seems to last a very long time. And it also shows that there are an immense variety of phenomena or an immense variety of monsters which can arise in that interregnum. But I'll finish my comments there and I'll see what Paolo has to say.
Thanks very much, Anton, for very thorough and generous comments on the book. Perhaps I'll just start by giving a sense of what the idea of the book was about. I mean, especially given that this talk is hosted by European Center for Populism Studies, and I guess there's many scholars of populism in the audience. In a way, what the book wanted to do was try to overcome some of the theoretical impasse of the debate around populism, which during the 2010s, for obvious reasons, had become the sort of central political question, as we were in a phase in which it looked as if, as in a way predicted by Laclau, politics had become populism, right? Really left, right, but also center. I mean, in a way, you can also look at people like even Macron and Renzi adopting kind of a populist rhetoric to support their neoliberal agenda. And to me, one of the limits of that, especially of the tradition of Laclau and Mouffe, had to do with the formalism, right? That also people like Yanis Stavrakakis and I think also you, Anton, have talked about, in terms of the focus on, say, on the paradigmatic, on the syntagmatic element of, to take a term from linguistics, namely the processes, the structures through which signifiers are organized, leading to a number of different combinations, right? I mean, this is the famous theory of, for example, the chain of equivalence in Laclau, which was very effective in capturing, how you say, the kind of the combinatory, the mercurial, the flexible character of populism, the way in which it was able to organize seemingly incoherent and contradictory demands and to appear at any point, at any latitude of the political spectrum. Yet at the same time, my sense was that that kind of approach ultimately, in a way, led to an overlooking of content, right? This focus on form led to an overlooking of content and an overlooking of the kind of the paradigmatic element, to take, again, a metaphor from linguistics. Namely, there was a lot of discussion on the fact that populists adopt, for example, a discourse of the people versus the elite, or that they are bombastic in their rhetoric, that they use charismatic mobilization, that they feed on emotions such as fear and anger. But there was little talking in terms of what are these new movements actually proposing, what are they doing once they are in government, and how are they building coalitions to support these projects. Right? And my sense was that this was the limit of discourse analysis, and there was a need in a way to make links to political economy, right? To questions of class, to questions of material structures and interest, which I think is in fact also a trend among young scholars in the circles, an attempt to reconcile political economy and discourse analysis. And my sense was also that in a way, populism was, in a way, at the beginning, I tried to look at the substantive content of populism as such, also in some essays I wrote in the late 2010s. But then in a way, I came to realize that populism didn't have a sort of internal substantive content, but was best understood precisely as an interregnum, as a moment of transition, as the point marking the decline of the neoliberal order, but also alluding to the emergence of a new possible order, right? Which is what I describe in the book as neo-statism. Right? In a way, the book remained a bit kind of in the balance between these two things. Like, it started as a book on populism, then only to realize that there was no way to explain the content of populism in the 2010s without engaging with this emerging neo-statist consensus. So what is neo-statism? Very simply put, it is a still amorphous and open consensus about the need for greater state interventionism, which is remarkable because, at least ideologically, at least rhetorically, one of the defining features of neoliberalism in all its different varieties, regressive, progressive, optimistic, and punitive, was a suspicion of the state. Margaret Thatcher saying that we want to reduce government, Ronald Reagan saying that he wants to tie the arms of government, Bill Clinton talking about the end of big government and the need for a government that is smaller and less bureaucratic, Tony Blair equally saying that we don't want a government for government's sake. And these are typical expressions, typical statements seen again and again in neoliberals of different brands, where a celebration of the power of the market went hand in hand with a denigration of the state. Then we know in practice, and this was also made evident in Anton Jäger's intervention in the forum that was just mentioned, that in fact, if we look at actual policy, the picture was far more complex. There's debate in political economy about the fact that neoliberalism was not just about a rollback of the state, but also about a rollout. And indeed, like private public finances initiatives, for example, like those carried out by labor, are very much a demonstration of that. Demonstration that, as in Philip Mirowski onion-shaped discourse, these pretense of anti-statism often serve to mask a reality in which the state was constructively used as a means to commodify new areas of society that were previously beyond the grasp of the market and market forces. But I think that ideologically, in a way, we also need to understand ideology in its own terms, right? And it is really significant how now, progressively in the mainstream, both the left and the right from different perspective, but also figures of the center, what we may describe as a sort of emerging post-neoliberal center, are making overtures around the need for greater state interventionism. And they're not just doing that covertly, in a way, well, being ashamed of doing that, but they are reclaiming actively that, right? Which is the kind of fundamental ideological element, right? There is a difference between doing things you're ashamed of doing, but in a way, necessity compels you to do, and another thing to come out openly and saying, we need to do this. So I think there is a general shift in policy perceptions and in the popular common sense, which are two separate though connected things. In economic science, there's been a number of trends, for example, in recent years that in a way militate against the neoliberal paradigm. Think about the return of neo-institutionalism, for example, the work by Acemoglu and others about the need for strong institutions, also as a necessary infrastructure for the market. Think about debates in national innovation systems, the work of Mariana Mazzucato on the entrepreneurial state, which fundamentally makes the case that even commercial success of companies such as Apple is actually premised on a very active intervention of the state. Or think about returns about the debate on sovereignty and authority, and also the continuing fortune, for example, of debates about Schmidt in political science, or in China, concepts such as neo-authoritarianism, or one could even bring in a kind of the traditionalism of Dugin. I mean, these are very different facets of what looks like the return of a common question, like the question of the state and the question of the role of state authority, which is thrown up precisely because of the failure of the cult of the market that was prominent during the neoliberal era to explain reality. So it is not just an empirical question. It is not just an empirical shift in policy. It is also an epistemic shift. The fact that the narrative of neoliberalism is not able to explain what is going on anymore. Much like what happened with the stagflation crisis, where the Keynesian paradigm was not able to explain the stagflation because it considered that inflation and employment were inversely related. We are now in a similar epistemic crisis. Neoliberal formulas, neoliberal theories cannot explain anymore what is happening to the economy, cannot explain anymore what is going on with society, nor provide credible solution. The other plane of this shift is public perceptions. A number of recent polls have demonstrated a greater availability of the public, of the population, in terms of greater state intervention. A Gallup poll in 2020 said that 54% of US citizens wanted the state to solve more problems vis-a-vis just 32% of the population back in the year 2000. At the same time, in the public debate, now you see many figures making a very explicit statement about the need for greater state interventionism. In Germany, a CDU politician published a collective book called Neustaat, which makes the case that we need a new state to face up all these new problems and dilemmas. In Italy, former Prime Minister Giuliano Amato has come out with this book, Bentornato Stato Ma, which is a curious kind of balancing attempt. So welcome back state, but, you know. And this is a guy who was actually very much involved in neoliberal policies and policies of privatizations back in the days, but now makes the statement that we need to recuperate at least some element of state interventionism. Similarly, in France, there are similar debates going on about the way in which the retreat of the state is actually what has led to the rise of figures such as Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour. For example, Gilles Clavreul, who is a civil servant in France, has published a book titled Dans les silences de l'État, which makes very much this case that fundamentally the rise of right-wing populism derives from this rollback of the state. And if we are to solve the root problems that led to all this discontent and to all this resentment, which are actually two separate things, we need a more activist and interventionist state. So having kind of tried to summarize the argument and now try to quickly address the main question that Anton was raising there. I mean, indeed, one interesting development here was the trajectory of Biden and Bidenomics, because what was in a way surprising and revealing at the start was that a figure such as Biden, a very centrist politician, one that in the past has approved many neoliberal measures, at the start of his presidency announced a program that took aback many people on the left because it looked quite ambitious in character. I mean, the total cost was around $7 trillion, and it comprised ambitious infrastructure investments. It comprised an ambitious social package with things that we Europeans take for granted, but in the US are not, like, you know, maternity leave, sick leave, the idea of inverting the race to the bottom by lifting minimum standards, minimum wage, and so on and so forth. However, as Anton has already said, this plan, which looked as something in between kind of progressive liberalism and a sort of new social democracy, has glaringly failed, has disastrously failed, right? And this is, to a great extent, it was very popular. I mean, polls consistently showed that it had around 68% of support among the US public, but it has foundered mainly because of, say publicly, because of the opposition of two centrist senators, Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, but more broadly because of a reluctance of a significant section of the Democratic Party to break from some of the key tenets of the neoliberal consensus. And this then leads me to another point, which Anton also raised. Indeed, what we see in this context is a state that is active and interventionist fiscally, in a sense that it has no qualms spending. Even Lindner in Germany basically now accepted that security comes before tight budgets, right? When it comes, for example, to war. But at the same time, it is a spending that is mediated via the private sector, right? So the state outcontracts companies to build bridges, to deliver masks, to deliver COVID tests and so on and so forth. And this is very different from the European socialist states, like social democratic states, probably of the 60s, the 70s, particularly the French model or the Italian model, where you had a large section of the economy that was nationalized, and where the state was not just spending in a sense of purchasing, but was active through state-owned enterprises in the economy, right, which played a strategic role, and where the sort of the concrete arm of state planning, right? The state was not just planning, it was actually directing the economy, because it controlled the commanding heights, or many of the commanding heights of the economy. But I think in the case of the US, if we look back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the difference of the New Deal was that the New Deal didn't just spend a lot. The New Deal also created institutions, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority. It created tons of agencies, tons of quangos, right? The most kind of one of the most deprecated organizations during the neoliberal era. A lot of government agencies with a lot of bureaucrats that provided the necessary organizational skeleton to really allow state intervention to be more than sustaining the economy, or than saving or bailing out the economy, but actually shaping the economy and constructing new industries, constructing new services, with the state really taking a mission-oriented, a proactive approach. Perhaps I'll end on that by saying that, like, the work of Mariana Mazzucato in this is quite interesting. Also, if you read her last book, Mission-Oriented Economics, because it also has some elements of analysis of discourse. So what she says is that in neoliberalism, the idea of state interventionism, there was an idea of state interventionism, but it always had to do with market failure, with solving market failure. So there was an acceptance that when the market fails, the state should intervene, as, for example, happened in 2008 when the state bailed out big banks and corporations. But there is a more active and proactive role of the state that is instead essential to a progressive neo-statism. So where the state doesn't see its mission as limited to either saving the market or creating the necessary preconditions for market development, but instead pursues discretionary goals that are only justified on the basis of being in the public good. Right? So building new services that the market cannot provide, building protection against climate change that the market cannot provide, planting trees in urban centers to ensure decent microclimate vis-a-vis extreme heat events. And this, I think, is the more bold and ambitious view of the state that the left should invest in and should bet on. And if this doesn't happen, if there is not this return in a way of a neo-modernist imagination about the state and its ability also to engineer social reality, the risk is that what we are going to be facing is what I describe in the book as a kind of proprietary protectionism, where the protection that is at stake from the right is protection of the haves vis-a-vis redistributive attempts, redistributive demands that are only going to grow more and more as we face an energy crisis, and obviously protection against aliens of different kinds, right? Be they minorities, be they migrants, or be they foreign nations that are perceived as a threat to the people and as a threat to the state. Maximilian, do you want to you want us to converse?
I thought Anton was going to intervene, but that sounds very interesting, and certainly a very broad, a broadly drawn, but at the same time very intricate and detail attentive diagnosis of the present, as you called it. My question, and this is similar to the question that that I asked you the last time we met, in fact, was that you sort of almost at the core of your book, you diagnose you diagnose a certain experience of the exopolitics of the sort of the globalized neoliberal world that you diagnose as over, and you call it an agoraphobia, a fear of open spaces. And what really interested me in our discussions, in your discussion of the book, and what interested me in reading the book, is that you touch on this sort of phenomenological core of sort of an experience at the heart of these sort of, at the end of the day, ideological reactions to a sort of a more imminent, more direct experience. But you never really take this I don't know if you want me to call it a metaphor, or if you see a concrete sort of phenomenological center to it. But can you expound on this experience of agoraphobia and how it perhaps changes, not only changes the politics of tomorrow, but how this experience of the fear of open spaces is different to fears and anxieties that kind of that came before it, for example?
Yes, I mean, in a way, this idea, I mean, this topological analysis that in a way was appeared at different points in the book, though it was never kind of completely developed, had to do with this realization, I mean, by analyzing, for example, discourse material, of how much of neoliberal discourse was really premised on this idea of open spaces, this idea of openness, this idea of elimination of barriers, this idea of exploding social units, right? Both kind of microeconomically, macroeconomically, politically, as if the problem was in the existence of these social units, right? That social units of any kind are bad as such. I mean, the nation, the company, as it was in the kind of the Fordist paradigm, and so on and so forth. And there was clear, because this idea of externalization, which actually you find in so many organizational and economic practices: outsourcing, outcontracting, offshoring, export, the external constraint, right? All this idea of the external, the outside, right? Which in some aspects is a kind of centrifugal logic, which is central to commerce and trade, right? With commerce and trade, already kind of Venetians and wanted to go as far as possible from their place, because the farthest you went, the higher the realization of the goods that you produced, in a way, the more precious they became. And this, in a way, this topological metaphor, I think, explains certain things about what happened with globalization, right? While the second movement of this recoil against globalization seems to be very much to have to do with an introflexion, or an attempt to re-anchor, to reorganize social units, which, I mean, to me was inspired by reading Hegel, but also by reading Polanyi, and finding kind of similarities. I mean, in the idea of Erinnerung as a kind of bringing back in, which is basically the final beautiful scene of the phenomenology of spirit, right, where the spirit comes back to itself. And this idea of interiorization or internalization in Polanyi, right? This sense that in moments of implosion, there is an instinct for society to go back to its center, which in the Western canon has often been understood as the state, the state as the center of society, as the center of authority, which allows a social formation to stick together in a way. Though that is, one can take that as a sort of isolationist or as a position, or as a self-centeredness, right? I mean, obviously there are risks in this logic. I'm not kind of advocating this logic as necessarily good. I'm more making the case that this is what is historically happened, and that kind of draws the field of possible combinations of responses that we can give. So in a way, my analysis is quite structuralist in a sense. It's quite I would say pessimistic in terms, but that is kind of the pessimism of Marx, right? When he says that men make history, but in conditions that they don't decide, and we create political discourses, but in conditions where we don't get to pick the signifiers. We only get to pick the significations, the meanings that are associated with those signifiers.
I see. And what's not clear to me is obviously, fears and anxieties have accompanied political life throughout history, and you go in depth in the book also on Hobbes' Leviathan and sort of the centrality of fear in state making. But would you say that the globalized agoraphobia is qualitatively different, is categorically different, or is it another step in how the state is conceived vis-a-vis certain insecurities and certain anxieties that it aims to defend against?
I mean, to me, going, because I realized I evaded your question on agoraphobia. I mean, indeed, to me, is more of a kind of general metaphor, but that explains a certain general unease in the public. To me, the inspiration there was when Plato makes this argument about the fact that there is a correspondence between certain political regimes and certain conditions of individual psychology, right? So in democracy, you will have a certain individual psychology, in oligarchy as well, and the same goes for monarchy, tyranny, and so on and so forth. And to me, the sense was that in this kind of situation of global disorder, this is also reflected in terms of individual and social experience, in this situation where the apparent emancipation of complete choice has actually resulted in a perception of precarity, right? Of complete insecurity, of instability, of exposure, right? And there actually the vocabulary of lexicon of Polanyi is extremely salient when we approach our era, right? The sense of being exposed to forces that you don't control. So anyway, the argument there is that this flat earth, this, as Thomas Friedman put it, this open world has resulted in a situation in which society lacks a sense of bearing, lacks a sense of interiority and exteriority, which is constitutive also of a sense of political autonomy and agency. So if you don't know what is inside and what is outside, that disrupts your ability to be an actor, right? Which by its very nature is a discrete entity.
And on the topic of agency and being an actor, and you talk about the, trying to develop a strategy for the post-pandemic left, and how the post-pandemic left relates to state power, and therefore finds an agency of its own, as you said, being, I forgot the exact word you used, but being able to generate sort of a new future rather than simply being passengers on it. And in the last chapter, you kind of you seek to get more concrete in that regard, and you formulate your vision of a democratic patriotism, as you call it. Mm-hmm. Now, this I thought was very interesting to me as well. On the one hand, I think it remains somewhat opaque in the way that you describe it in the final chapter. perhaps necessarily so. Obviously, it's a conceptual, it's a theoretical argument. But obviously, and as you touched on before, the sort of the classical right understanding of patriotism as it links to the nation, to the people, and so on, is, as you touched on, always deals with a certain excluded other. It deals with aliens, with a certain a certain kernel of externality that, in its becoming full, has to be excluded. So, to what degree is this democratic patriotism different? Essentially, how does it avoid these structures of enjoyment that we know so well from sort of reactionary nationalist discourse, where such an excluded other is needed, and at the same time where the nation or the people as folk are enjoyed as such? So how does the democratic patriotism avoid such traffics, or does it, or is it just a reformulation of the same structures?
Yes. So briefly, as there are other people who want to intervene, I'd say that in general, yeah, it was a very difficult chapter to write, also because us on the left have very big problems dealing with the nation. But I've become persuaded over the last years that, in a way, we need to address that question, right? In a sense that, as many sociologists have put it, we accept that there is class solidarity, but we forget that there is also such a thing as national solidarity, that there is actually a sense of identification in the nation, with all the huge problems and contradictions that carries. I mean, we also saw that with the war in Ukraine. People really cannot make sense of why people would be ready to die on both sides of the conflict, right? Because a sort of methodological individualism, in a way, is still dominant in our understanding. So, very simply put, my normative proposal there was that in order to, as a necessary vehicle for this more interventionist state politics, we also need to reassert a sense of our particular belonging to specific political communities. I mean, this is in a way just a restatement of the obvious if you read the likes of even kind of Kant or Hegel. I mean, like even Kant, normally considered as a philosopher of cosmopolitanism, he had perfectly clear in mind this plurality of national communities. The fact that, there's many polities, there's many societies, and that means that you always need to mediate between this kind of particular and the universal. And so basically, just to conclude, my sense is that what is necessary is a reclaiming of patriotism in a kind of minimal sense of an acceptance of one's involvement and obligation to the community or the communities one is part of, right? I mean, local, national, whatever, regional, and the kind of the situatedness, right? If we want to take a term from kind of feminist studies, the fact that we are not kind of, we are doing politics within and from these particular polities.
All right, with that, I will open the floor for further questions and further discussion. I see Azize has raised her hand. Azize, please, the floor is yours. You're still muted. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I think now you hear me. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this timely and interesting presentation. You are, to my understanding, you are referring to a tension between hyper-globalization that is brought in by neoliberal international structure and the endopolitics that has been triggered by pandemic. Do you think people's demand for a kind of inward turn in terms of economy and national politics might be temporary? Because, pandemic also made us dream about our lives in the past. And I think it was a tough teacher in that sense. Just, I would like to hear your views on the temporariness of this demand for inward turn. Or maybe we are looking for a different kind of globalization where we can find a meeting point for our concerns for the external and for our aspirations for the internal. And what do you think about the explanatory power of the term globalization to describe the new landscape? Thank you so much. We don't hear you, sorry.
You're muted.
Also, Anton was raising his hand.
Should we take a couple of questions together then?
Yeah.
Maybe it's best that you answer this question first, because my question is not typically related.
All right. So yes, I mean, thanks very much for your question. What would you say? I mean, you know, for there was, for example, in the LSE review of books review, there was a point that was raised, and the kind of reviewer said basically the most problematic part of the book was my dire prediction on globalization, like in chapter 2. I think that part of that seems to have been confirmed. I mean, actually, I was not the first to write about it. Already in the 2010s, many people were making similar predictions, but I think it was only confirmed by what happened, especially the war in Ukraine, right, where we get the sense that we are moving towards a multipolar globalization, but is not such a nice scenario as perhaps some of us thought. It looks more like kind of a bipolar world, a new sort of bipolar world with different spheres of influence, one basically US dominated, the other one dominated by China, and in which it looks as if, you know, markets and politics are going to kind of reorganize around these different spheres. And recently, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, made the case that we are past globalization. And actually, you see companies like Intel, for example, investing a lot in the European continent as they're trying to shorten their supply chains. So I think there is some element of truth and in this post-globalization and deglobalization trend. There will be some elements of regionalization, like European level. There will be some element of renationalization. There will be some elements of relocalization. I mean, think about renewable energy and the way in which structurally it entails a certain degree of relocalization, for example, of energy production. Now, energy accounts for around 25% of global trade. So if a significant chunk of that is produced locally, that already brings a significant shift there. This doesn't mean that we are moving towards an autarkic world. I mean, not even North Korea, the famous hermit state, is autarkic in the full sense, right? Actually, just survives because of support from the Chinese state. But that we are past peak globalization, so to speak, or we are past peak globalization of this globalization, given that this globalization has just been the second in recent history, like after the globalization at the beginning of the 20th century. And indeed, I think that many want a peaceful world, a world of peaceful coexistence, want also some form of different, whatever, transnational integration, if we don't want to call it globalization. But now we also need to be aware of the fact that against the common sense of neoliberals, economic interdependence does not necessarily lead to peaceful coexistence, right? There's no Wandel durch Handel, like as Merkel said in reference to Russia. And then you see some interesting kind of balancing attempts, for example, the dual circulation policy in the 14th five-year plan in China, which basically imagines a two-tier economy or a dual economy, dual circulation economy. Basically, you have a national economy that is fairly protected and where you guarantee strategic goods such as food, energy, and technology. And then you have an internationalized sector of the economy, which can achieve higher profits, which can then be redistributed also locally. And actually, this type of understanding is also the one that Brian Dees, the chief of economic advisor, has been proposing in the case of the US, to failing in doing that. So I think it is quite an interesting balancing attempt, right? Vis-a-vis the whole idea of globalization as a pervasive force, sucking in the entire planet and all its recesses. This more, I would say, kind of two levels vision of what an international integration process could be like.
Anton, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I have very little to add. It was simply that if we return to the original, more normative parts of the argument, where you say what kind of position should be taken in response to that, I think there was a famous question that Bertolt Brecht asked in the 1940s: what to do about the fact that the Nazis have managed to secure full employment. So the sort of classical dilemma with which socialists were confronted at the time. It at least seems to be that even if there's not deglobalization, there is a form of reglobalization. So there is a question of how you reconfigure some of these international supply chains, while at the same time, it is impossible to win these electoral platforms without having at least something to say about protection. And I was just wondering whether Paolo could say something slightly more, for example, in reference to the Mélenchon campaign. Do you think that that is a sort of sensible approach to this particular question, or do you think you should be more offensive? Also because, as we said, populism in the 2010s was very much a phenomenon which thrived on demobilization. So you see this was clear in the Le Pen vote, that it is a vote that prospers of abstentionism rather than it does about mobilizing new voters. And if you look at the aftermath of the lockdowns, it seemed to have increased his sense of demobilization and the decrease of political agency that came with it. But whether you see any sort of signs within the recent presidential contest that there's a way of talking about protection and of countering the effects of demobilization as such.
Yes, and I think that there is an element to what you describe as hyperpolitics in terms of this combination on the one hand of kind of affective intensification of certain debates, but that happens on a surface in a general situation of general kind of passivity, ultimately, of the public, or where also peaks of emotional mobilization are then ensued by moment of apathy, and where much of the enthusiasm tends to go into kind of identity politics or into cultural wars and such things. What would you say? I mean, I think that the big challenge now is to move beyond a certain presentism. There was already also there in a certain kind of blitz mentality of populist movements on the left. Like you think about Podemos, the way in which it was constructed as an electoral machine to win the next election in 1 month, in 2 months, pretty much as a social movement, right? Trying to kind of mobilize in the here and now, but lacking a more long-term vision, because there was this sense that we were in a constant emergency situation where you had to win now or never. Something that can help us in doing that is this new grand narrative of the green transition, right? And the way in which the problem of climate change, in a way, forces to plan ahead in terms of decades, right? From here to the 2030, from here to the 2040, and so on and so forth. So what I see in people like Mélenchon is in this campaign, vis-a-vis the campaign in 2017, is to wear more statesman's-like robes. I mean, think about, for example, now his proposal to become the next prime minister, asking French citizens to give him an additional 3 or 4 million votes, basically fundamentally in exchange implicitly for support to Macron, right? This is a sort of implicit narrative there. Or think about Spain, is also very interesting. The case of Yolanda Díaz, who is a very different persona vis-a-vis Pablo Iglesias. So if Pablo Iglesias was this typical populist, charismatic, effective politician, Yolanda Díaz is praised for being technocratic, for being an excellent labor expert and a labor minister was being a very safe pair of hands in terms of delivering policies during the pandemic, and now actually managing to implement a major labor reform in Spain, which is completely counter neoliberal, as it makes permanent contracts the default form of contract, meaning that companies need to have very good reasons to justify why they are not using this form of contract. So I'm not sure if I'm kind of answering your question there, but to me, in a way, some of a possible way out of the present impasse has to do with recuperating this focus on content, which also means, in a way, trying to refashion a more coherent idea of the good society, as it were, right? Good society not defined merely in economic terms, but defined also in kind of like social and environmental terms. Because without that, we are caught in this situation of purely tactical situation, as it were, right? Of having to kind of look ahead to the next elections, to the next fight, but without any sense of what is the kind of the long game, right? Strategically.
There's one final question in the chat from Bulent. It's been addressed largely in your previous answer, but he raises an interesting question on how the Great Recoil changes the trajectory of supranational organizations and international organizations. And it links to another question that I had, because your book is obviously very timely in that it was released after the start of the COVID pandemic, and so was able to take its consequences into account. But the next big event, the war in Ukraine, obviously has kind of, to a degree, changed the playing field. And on one hand, you could consider the war in Ukraine as just being a classic restatement of sovereignty, protection, and control. So very much in the theme of the big state that you touch on. But at the same time, this state of war and this return to a more bipolar world, as you called it, is in a sense also returned to a sort of a more classical conception of protection, a more classical conception of control vis-a-vis sort of brute force and the power of the state, rather than sort of a more nuanced articulation. So how does the Great Recoil, on the one hand, change the international playing field, and on the other hand, how does the security situation today, or has it changed your analysis in the large scale?
Yes, I'd say that, some things are quite evident. There's a move from multilateralism to bilateralism in many processes of international relations. There is a fading away of this notion of an invisible yet pervasive global order that we are all caught in, and doesn't need to kind of speak its own name because everyone knows that, right? Which is in a way precisely kind of the manifestation of moments of hegemony, right? There was the US-led globalization. Everybody knew that it was there. It had a very loose institutional setup, actually, right? And it created this idea of a global market that was stable and that you could operate in safely. While now, actually, as an Italian author called Alessandro Aresu, who is an advisor of Mario Draghi, puts it, he recuperates this notion from Max Weber of political capitalism. So where basically there is a fusion between economy and politics, the separation of economy from politics fades away, and there is actually a realization of the returning supremacy of politics. I think on this count, clearly the war in Ukraine has showed the supremacy of politics over economics at all levels. Russia's invasion of Ukraine makes no economic sense whatsoever. Oligarchs' wealth has been readily sacrificed from the Russian side on the basis of national interest. Right, they've lost their super yachts and so on and so forth with incredible ease, Conversely, also on the other side, right? I mean, now basically Europe is discussing an energy embargo, which would be and probably will be economically extremely damaging for the European continent. But again, here politics comes first. So in a way, what happens is that this illusion of this somehow kind of global ecumen, this global community, this international community fades away, and we are instead forced to confront once again the question of authority, right? And in fact, the existence of different fields of authority that are often butting heads against one another. So we can expect more market protectionism, different spheres, different superpowers trying to protect their captive markets. We can expect more frictions and more proxy wars, right? We can expect, in a way, the typical problems of international relations to resurface in often ugly ways.
All right, thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I believe we'll conclude there. I want to thank Dr. Gerbaudo for presenting his work and presenting some very interesting perspectives on the politics of today and the politics of tomorrow. Dr. Jäger's very compelling contextualization and his very interesting and thought-provoking internal questions, and all of you in the audience and everyone who tuned into our live stream for enjoying this edition of ECPS Book Talks. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.
To you. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you.